Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Books That Move Us book club. Today, we're digging into Evenings with the Orchestra by a name that some of you might recognize very well, the French Romantic composer Hector Berlioz. Our violinist, Roxane Frangie Solowey, selected this book for today's book club meeting. And I'm gonna introduce her and the other folks involved in our panel today shortly. My name is Sara Stovall, and I'm the communications manager for Sarasota Orchestra. And before we dive into this book today, I want to give a couple of handy tips for those of you who are tuning in live on Zoom or watching the recording later, for you to engage and keep the discussion going. Here on Zoom, there are a couple of features. There's a chat function, which I hope you all will warm up and share your responses to anything we talk about today. And if you'd like to submit a discussion topic or a question for us to take up, there's also a Q&A feature here. When you're using the chat, make sure your settings are set to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what you have to say. And if you're tuning in later on Facebook, there's you've got the comment section there as well, and we'd love it if you're tuning in there with us on social media, if you would share your thoughts there and keep the conversation going. So today, in addition to myself, we've got Roxane here, our Fearless Book Club leader for this session, and Kerry Smith, our director of artistic planning, is also joining us for the chat. And we start off every book club meeting with a round of a little icebreaker. And today it's what's in my mug, because nothing goes better with a book than something cozy and hot and refreshing. So in my mug today, I've got a cup of rooibos tea. What about you, Roxane? What do you have in your mug?
Well, in the morning, I'm always a two-fisted drinker. So I've got my coffee sweetened with a little bit of maple syrup.
Nice.
And a glass of water.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And I guess I'll join in. I have a cup of coffee. This is Pete's Coffee, and it's in, and I'm joining us not from Sarasota, but from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm here with family. This is my Aunt Megan's mug, thus the M. And it's great to be with you guys.
Yeah, it's good to be together. Good to see all of you all. And we're glad to have those of you who are tuning in live too with us. So Roxane, would you mind telling us a little bit about your history with this book? You know, when it came into your life and onto your shelf, and what it's meant to you over the years.
I heard about it, I think when I was in school, and about 30 years ago, I was on the road a lot for about 4 years in the US and in Europe, in the Southeast Asia, and also back here in Sarasota. I was playing in the pit when I first landed here in 1992. And somewhere during the period of time that I was in Europe, we were playing in the Châtelet Theater in Paris. And I think that's when I started reading this book, because Berlioz talks about the Parisian musicians so much. And we actually had some experiences with them. And so many of the things that Berlioz talks about in his book were experiences that I was having at that time. And it was fascinating for me to hear him say irreverent things in the beginning of his book, like the musicians take their seats. There is a very dull modern French opera being given, but they take their seats with obvious disgust and ill temper. They do not condescend to tune up. And it was just, the irreverence. And then they start getting together and Berlioz reads to them because they're so bored in the pit, and the conductor allows it because he understands. And the closest we got to that, because we had much more integrity, I would say, was that we would all read in the pit, especially during musicals. And so you knew when a musician was very absorbed in a book because they would miss an entrance. But even then the conductor would not ever get angry because they understand. So there were just so many parallels. And even he speaks about the impresarios of the day and the producers of the day. And our producer for our West Side Story tour was a German producer who was very flamboyant and charismatic. And he actually organized a recording for us because the band was quite good with West Side Story soundtrack in Berlin. And being the cheapskate that he was, only had one copy. This was back in the analog days. And he had reel-to-reel masters, about 2 reels, I think, of that recording session, which was really good and took 2 days and I'm sure was very expensive. He threw the masters in the trunk of his car and there they melted.
Oh, no.
That. So there were no other master copies made. And that was, just like goofy things like that, So that's what drew me to this book.
That's excellent.
And there were also other things, because music has always been so tied to politics and the social times of the day. This particular tour of West Side Story opened on the 1-year anniversary of the wall coming down in Berlin.
Yeah.
And we opened in East Berlin.
Wow.
And so, Berlioz also talks about the audience and the rabble of the audience. And that night, opening night of this entire production, Maria was sick and she couldn't go on.
Wow.
And the understudy was not yet ready. So the producer comes out and speaks to the audience in German and says, I'm so sorry, we can't go on tonight. And the crowd was loud and furious and boisterous. But he calmed them. I'm sure he was thinking on his feet and said, don't worry, we're going to get you tickets for, a few weeks from now, you can come. And they were still angry. But then we were released out into the streets of East Berlin. And I was so excited to see what's happening on the 1-year anniversary of the wall coming down. And it was surprisingly very somber, very low key, no celebration. There were a few trinkets being sold, to tourists like us. It was just very interesting.
That's amazing. The anecdote about the masters going into the trunk of the car and meeting their demise feels like totally in line with a lot of anecdotes in this book.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm just reminded of that anecdote. I think it was in the chapter about Spontini, who is an opera composer that I knew nothing about until reading this book, like a lot of names that Berlioz brings up and drops. But I think there was one part where he was getting so much flack from the singers saying this is impossible to sing. And so he threw it into the fire and is the manuscript that he was in the process of writing and had it just narrowly miss complete destruction. I thought, wow, that was yeah, things were a little more fragile, I guess, back then in terms of how music was produced and reproduced and preserved. Yeah, it seems really, some of the talk of like, how these productions came together is really incredible to me, that because they were working with all these, this hard copy stuff that was being, created in real time sometimes, and, without fax machine, or not without Xerox machines and all of that, having the role of the person in the orchestra who's responsible for getting all the sheet music around.
Being a trained copyist was
yes.
definitely an important job at the time.
Yes, a very important job. But yeah, that those anecdotes really stuck with me in terms of what's different, what's different today.
And you mentioned Spontini, Sarah, and that was another thing that I really enjoyed about this book was Berlioz as the critic and being the champion of composers that he really loved and works that he loved. And there were some that I'd never heard of before, like Gaspar Spontini. And I searched for La Vestale, which he quotes in the book, and found an aria that I think you're going to play for us.
Yeah, I'm just gonna share a screen
Amazing,
so you'll see it
beautiful.
pop up. And here we are. I'm going to, whoops, press play, and you just let me know that you can hear it clearly.
Yeah. Wow, that was gorgeous.
Unbelievable.
Ah,
I had never heard it before.
yeah, there were so many names like like Spontini, and others, who, yeah, I had to kind of read. I had to go through this with like my smartphone in hand, because it seemed like every other page I'd be looking up a new name of some composer, or contemporary that I hadn't heard of. And one thing I regret is that, because there wasn't at that time, no recording technology, that so many of the artists that he mentioned, I don't have access to the so many the singers that he talks about, because of because the technology wasn't there to capture those performances. But I just, yeah, it was it was like an exercise. It was such a brilliant dive into music history, and kind of like look at to look at these composers, who made these beautiful, as we've heard, beautiful contributions to the canon, that I think he lamented. I think with Spontini, he dedicated so many pages to him because he just felt like maybe he didn't get his day in the sun, and he's working to affect that, to change that. So, and here he is, how 170 years later, he's still bringing all Spontini to new fans.
Rightly so. I mean, that's gorgeous. Maria Callas, by the way.
Maria Callas.
Yeah. I was thinking about that. I think in one of our previous chats we had talked about, or I had mentioned that it was like strange thinking of Berlioz of having like opinions and being a real man and having a sense of humor. It's like, I think with a lot of composers who are long dead, we kind of put them on a pedestal and almost think of them as like sentient beings that gave us these gifts, but not as being humans, as being people. And, you know, kind of in line with what Sara said, just thinking about Berlioz, considering Paganini and how important he was. And that was really interesting to me. I feel like, yeah, of course, we don't have audio recordings of Paganini, but you have all of these written accounts of how he played like he was possessed by the devil because he had this technical ability that was like, just hadn't been seen. He was like the ultimate virtuoso, and is still like, you know, his works and are still like, you know, the guidepost in terms of technical ability. But reading the account of you know, the end of his career where he was dealing with a throat condition, it sounded like something like tuberculosis that had like manifested in his throat, and then he couldn't speak.
Yeah.
And that at the end of his life, when he would play, he would only play with friends and with no audiences, but they would play Beethoven quartets and Beethoven trios. And I would like give, you know, cut off a finger or something to be able to hear what that sounded like.
Yeah,
It would be amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, and especially because it's someone that you think of as being like, you know, a flashy wizard, but when, you know, how he would approach Beethoven Opus 132 when he himself is ill and couldn't speak, I would love to know.
Yeah.
Would love to hear that.
There were also the famous composers that Berlioz would bring up, Beethoven and Mendelssohn. And then that kind of brings us to the question of nationalism and stereotypes that come up in the book. And even watching, as you mentioned, the human element of Berlioz and his inconsistencies, talking about Judaism and how Jewishness was regarded in the day, the stereotypes, and some of the kind of off-color comments that he himself would make that were kind of alarming at times, and also interesting because there's a quote that someone makes in a book about Beethoven, and Berlioz takes exception. It's actually a quote about Mendelssohn, and Berlioz that is upset that this author, Wilhelm von Lentz, who's a Russian, actually says that the Hebraic element discernible in Mendelssohn's thought will keep his music from becoming the property of the whole world without distinction of time or place, which of course was not true. And then Berlioz goes on to say, but Mendelssohn was more Lutheran than Jewish, when everybody knows that. And that's messed up too, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And
I wonder, you know, with, you know, some of his off color or offensive, you know, or things, you know, things that really won't hold up today at all. Like with his job, you know, making his bread and butter as a music critic, and you know, he didn't mince any words either when saying how, you know, how he felt about having to be read, and how difficult he felt it was to find a receptive audience for his print work, and I do wonder how much of you know, some of these off-color comments are you know, him trying to get a rise out of the reader, evoke that feeling of that shock value, that distaste, almost as, you know, I don't know how much he doesn't, you know, throughout the book he doesn't give too much regard for public taste in general, and he's just he's willing to, you know, be unfiltered in some distasteful ways in order to, yeah, just I think to provoke, for deliberately being provocative.
And it also, it shows the duality that so many people grapple with. And I kept thinking about Bernstein, because he also was a conductor, composer. And his quote about Wagner was, "I hate Wagner, but I hate him on my knees."
Mm.
And I think he worshiped the music, but, you know, hated elements of what the man got involved with.
Right.
So it's just what you find out about your artistic idol personally, you know, in their personal lives, sometimes so disappointing.
I think I had shared, or we talked on the Books of Note podcast with Jeffrey Kane when we read Dangerous Melodies. It came up that, you know, Wagner wrote this this treatise on anti-Semitism in music under an assumed name, but I think everybody knew it was him. But part of his motivation for doing that, and I have learned that a lot of motivation for anti-Semitism was it wasn't actually, it became a sort of more popular movement that became entangled with nationalism and was you know, used to the advantage of politicians like Hitler and others. You know, in the 20th century, it really came to a head, but it actually, I don't think, was as common. But Wagner tapped into something, and it was a way for him to try to cut down his competition, which is composers like Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn, who were extremely popular. And even though, you know, like some of them weren't practicing because they had these family connections, they came under scrutiny. But yeah, there were a couple strange you know, strange additions in the book. I think he also made an off-color comment when he was talking about his experience in London, and said something that he would be hard pressed to be convinced that the Chinese are not demented.
Right. Yes. You know? And he's not much of an ethnomusicologist at all. Berlioz. Yeah, I think his sense of, you know, what, you know, music is and what art, you know, what has artistic merit was very narrow. Maybe unfortunately narrow.
Yeah. I think like one of the benefits of living in a globalized world and having disciplines like ethnomusicology is that you actually realize that even though, you know, in all of these cultures across the world, there are different instruments and things like that, so much of what was created in Western Europe actually there is a very direct correlation between, you know, Asian instruments and African instruments. And
right.
Yeah. So anyway, so it's his very narrow viewpoint that you know, I personally just throw in the trash. But I think it's important to know about these things and to know about, you know, the correlation between that. Even like, you know, the chapters on Napoleon, it was like unbelievable. In some ways, politicians are the same way, and in some ways, it's like I can't believe this. I can't believe the ego on this guy.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. In some cases, I was, you know, reading. I would have to remind myself when Berlioz was not referencing the musicians of the orchestra, that all the people he was talking about are, you know, except for the stories that are just, you know, are fiction, pure fiction. Like, so I had to remind myself throughout that some of these people that he's, you know, referencing were real, real people, you know, who lived and worked and sang and performed in his day. Like and throughout this book, they all kind of assumed a bit of a larger than life cast to me.
Until he cuts them down to size.
Yes. Yes, very true. Yeah. I know. For me, I don't know if anybody else who's tuning in had this effect, but it was tough to like Berlioz throughout a large part of the book, and just because, you know, there's it is a lot of his tone is very cynical. It's very ironic. It's not particularly. He doesn't have. We've all been told if you don't have anything nice to say, but he didn't shy away from putting it into many, many pages. But that was his job, right? He was a music critic, and he took that very, very seriously. But I think toward the end, I did warm to him. Maybe I got used to his tone a little bit. But he, throughout the book, he has, so much to say about what's wrong, or what's, how much art has to suffer in order to be brought to performance, to an audience. But I think toward the end, we found a much more hopeful and an optimistic Berlioz, who isn't quite so down on the art world, at least in terms of the musicians, the people, the artists themselves who are keeping it going. Who knows if he would ever develop any respect for the public and the audience.
It seems like he did toward the end, because there was a quote in there about how if the public, at first he says something like, it would seem the most ordinary common sense that public's taste should be formed by the artists, but unfortunately it is contrariwise, and the artist's taste is actually deformed and corrupted by the public's. That I think eventually later in the book he says, but after frequent hearings, the public does know when music is very, very good. And I have to say that I felt kind of almost the opposite of that. The orchestra, there was a series of seasons where we were playing All I Ask of You from Phantom of the Opera several times a season. And it got to the point where you'd see it in your folder and you'd groan, And we played it like that too. We played it very flat. And then one season we actually had a Phantom from Broadway, an actor who had played Phantom, sing it with us. And he brought to it so much emotion and so much feeling and so much musicianship and a depth of passion to his performance that we were all aghast at how poorly we'd been playing it, collectively. And we changed the way we played it ever after that. It just took someone with a devoted sense of musicianship to even the most common sounding piece of music to open our eyes to the way something sounded. And Anu actually did the same thing for Tchaikovsky with us.
Oh.
I think it was Tchaik 5 we did with her, her audition concert with us, where she came in and said, and Tchaikovsky was Russian. Russian music, you put the accent on the second beat of the measure as they speak and put the accent on the second syllable of the word.
Oh, that's fascinating. I learned something today.
And well, we did too that day, and when she told us that, it completely changed the flavor of Tchaikovsky for us, and we performed it differently. We felt differently about it. It was a fresh piece of music at that point.
Yeah.
That's
I wonder,
amazing.
oh, sorry, Kerry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that's amazing. That's so nice to hear. What were you going to say, Sarah?
I was just wondering, thinking back on the, how the advent of recording technology wasn't until, really, decades. I don't think, the very first, ways of recording audio like started to be invented a couple of decades after this came out. And so like, I just have to wonder, with the ability, especially what we have now, of having so much music on demand, what Berlioz would have thought about the ability of repetition to give great works their time and the necessary time in audiences' hearts and minds for their greatness to, I guess, to register. I wonder if like if he would, I mean, I have to think he would have probably absolutely loved recording technology because of its ability to, bring the music into your homes, and, and that, it takes away that public spectacle element of concerts and performances that he seemed to really detract and feel like that it took away from the truth of expression that he was so obsessed with as a key element of successful artistic performance. This notion of, the music for the music's sake, the art for art's sake, and that really slippery notion of truth of expression.
It's an interesting question, and Roxane, I'd be really curious to hear about this because I know you've probably done, recording, as you mentioned, on tour and, with like many times in your career. But I've kind of found in my own experience of just working with soloists and being able to hear lots and lots and lots of concerts, there definitely is a dichotomy between certain soloists who record a lot. And it almost doesn't matter who the conductor is, and, first rehearsal, they show up and it sounds the same. And I don't mean it necessarily in a bad way, but it's consistently the same for every performance and the very first rehearsal. They play it the way they play it. And then there are many soloists who come in and they're flexible and they're responsive, and every night is different. And they almost feel like a sort of like to what Sarah is speaking to, there's like an artistic integrity and in living in the moment musically. And I'm actually kind of neutral, because I think that a lot of those artists that record and have a very specific imprint do a great job, and there's no reason to necessarily disparage that. But it's interesting because I do feel like the recording industry is so oriented towards perfection. Mm-hmm. It can almost like overcorrect and become sterile. so yeah.
Example of that, actually, when Glenn Gould redid his Goldberg variation recordings, he did them as a young man, and then he did them, I don't know, 20 years later as a mature soloist. And there's an interview even about him saying, oh yeah, the way I did it back then, I didn't know what I was doing, but I much prefer his recording as a younger man, because his older recordings as an older person, he determined his tempos mathematically. Mm-hmm. He divided them in half or he doubled them, and they just sounded very sterile. Mm-hmm. And then his younger, where he didn't put so much thought behind it, numerically seemed to have more flow to it. But there's definitely, Kerry, to your question, when we do a Masterworks performance, we have 3 or 4 performances, and over the course of that series, it's interesting to see how things evolve. Mm-hmm. And the trust between everyone, the conductor, the soloist, the orchestra. And then as you get into Saturday night and Sunday afternoons, the part that the audience plays, which is, when we've been together through, going out for drinks Saturday night after the performance, and then you come back Sunday morning and it's early for some people, but then that Sunday afternoon crowd is always so plugged in energetically. And then you definitely feel the electricity going back and forth between everybody. So you hear, most of our soloists have been very flexible and really fun to work with, and to see how things evolve. And definitely the more flexible they are, the more fun that it is.
Yeah.
There's definitely an element of trust and involved in being open.
Yeah, I think that, I kind of lean towards that. I think it's really exciting also as an audience, because in my role at the orchestra, I truly am like a professional audience member, which is fun. I love that. And it is really exciting when someone like me, like if I get to hear Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I hear the difference, or I say, oh, some like transition in the second movement was really different today. That's fun. It's nice. It reminds you that the orchestra is like a living, breathing animal.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Definitely. And some of the most memorable moments I've had is when we've all been in the same space at the same time, all plugged in together. And then you can just feel the energy of the audience come in. And it's really incredible moment. And you feel when we're breaking for intermission, you can just tell we're all in the same space. It's very special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you make of the audiences that Berlioz described and throughout? I mean, I thought I think I laughed my whole way through, I think what it was, evenings 8 and 9, where he's talking about the Le Claque and
Oh yeah.
these essentially hired audiences that are trained like an infantry, like drilled into how to react so as to like almost control the performances themselves.
It's amazing. Is this really true? Because
Right?
the payment involved, amazing. But it's, when you have someone in the audience that's cheering you on and you can hear someone yell your name, usually it happens in high schools or whatever, you hear
Sure.
it, it's just like that kind of thing. I mean, it was interesting for sure. Funny, very funny.
Yeah.
But it did remind me of some of the European audiences that we would have.
Really?
Yes, the one I spoke about in Berlin, and then when we were in the Châtelet Theater, this is another example of our producer taking shortcuts. The Parisians have a union, and our producer chose to ignore that union. So when we came in for opening night in Paris, the musicians from Paris were in the pit and not allowing us to go in because they wanted to make a point. And the security pulled them out. And then the next night, the same thing happened. And this time they had their children with them to tell the audience, we're losing money here because you've got these American musicians in the pit. What do you think of that? And they spoke to the audience, and I think the audience was kind of annoyed with the musicians a little bit. You're holding up the show. We want to see the show.
Right.
And then the Parisian musicians ended up causing minor damage on the way out. But the producer ended up paying them. He ended up paying them off, which was the right thing to do. We have rules and they have rules. We have a union here, and one of the first stories in the book is about composers and artists not being paid for their work.
Yeah.
And now we have unions and unfair lists, and so you're held accountable, and you've got to pay musicians and artists their due. So it's hard to imagine creating entire works of art and then not being paid for that back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, intellectual property law goes on the list of other advancements, I suppose, that we've made since Berlioz's time.
Yeah. And even problems with that, with my string quartet, we still get little bits of money from streaming services. But we'll get, a tenth of a penny for every So what's the middleman getting here? If we're getting a tenth of the penny and people are paying $1.99 to hear that, where's all that money going?
Right.
But I think there's some projects like with Bitcoin and things like that are finding ways to copyright intellectual property these days that are in the works. It could be very interesting.
Yeah. No, I think about that quite a bit too, because you hear about, even pop stars that are making tons and tons of money, but they still know that it's only a fraction of what they could be making. It's interesting. I did want to share, I don't think I had mentioned this to you both before, but I actually studied in Montreal, and and was able to spend some time in France. But one thing culturally that's really interesting about Quebec and France and probably other European countries too is that students are allowed to unionize.
Oh, wow.
There's like a very, yeah, there's a very different, I think, approach. And anyway, but hearing your story reminded me that when I was in my master's, the students voted to go on strike for like 3 months because they were looking at a tuition increase. And I wasn't really a part of it, but was definitely affected by it. So I think that they're used to that. And I know that in France, you know, high schoolers do it often for various reasons. And often it's like a reaction to something going on politically. They say, we won't go to school unless we see some change or, you know, so it's just interesting in the US that's like so not done.
Right.
Was it successful, Kerry?
That's a good question. I don't even remember. I actually don't even remember, but I will say that in Quebec, they, you know, it's really great. And I was in a master's program and had some funding, but for undergraduates, you know, a year of university is like $3,000. So there was something to be protected there. It was much cheaper than other provinces in Canada, but it's a good question. It was definitely very memorable. I'm sure it was very memorable to the politicians there, but I think they do it pretty often. Anyway, that was all just to say that I'm sure that like the audience members were probably also people who had participated in other strikes in other like areas of their lives. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, but yeah, you know, especially in the pandemic, I think it's, you know, so important that we are conscientious and practice, you know, good business practices and things. And
certainly,
you know, we're definitely very cognizant of that at the Sarasota Orchestra. And yeah, it's but yeah, many are not so lucky. And I haven't tracked particularly well how it's going in Europe, although I do know that, for instance, in London, like at the Wigmore Hall, they're fundraising for themselves, but also simultaneously for the artists coming through. And the executive director there has been very vocal that they need government assistance because English freelance musicians are really suffering. So
it's great.
So there was a section toward the end of the book where Berlioz is talking about in order to restore and protect high quality art, 4 things are needed all at once and in the same place, which I thought was interesting. He named them as authority, intelligence, devotion, and money. And he was upset that these things rarely occur. And because of that, he was concerned that the quality of arts would be sustained for the future. And I thought it was very simplistic that he could come, you know, distill it down to 4 points of how to sustain art. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what, I think he's right about that, because it's not very often when you get those 4 elements together. And I'd be curious to see if anybody's listening, what they would think about it too. Because one of the things that stuck out for me in his 4, authority, intelligence, devotion, and money, was that instead of passion, I thought, why wouldn't he pick passion? And it's because it's subjective. You know, it involves a little bit of the person, but devotion is a different thing.
Right. Devotion seems much more, it's something rooted, it's something more lasting, whereas, you know, passion can be flash in the pan. You know, if passion can flare up and flame out, you know, quickly without devotion to back it up, then, you know, maybe a passion can become a phase or a fad.
Devotion is long term.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I do want to put it to, anybody who's listening in, of those, those four key elements, which the authority, intelligence, devotion, and money. Do you like, is it necessary to have, is it essential to have all four of those things together? And, what happens when any one of those is, falls by the wayside, isn't present? Are there, do any of those four stand out to either of you, Kerry or Roxane, as particularly like, do all these have equal weight, or is one of these, is one of these more easy to come by, are any of these more elusive than others?
Yeah, I'll share my theories. I've been thinking about it. I was kind of thinking about the split between, orchestra, or those who make sort of the performance happen, and then the audience members. And I had thought that there's some overlap. So authority, intelligence, and devotion are all critical, I think, to make the performance happen. And then intelligence, devotion, and money is critical from the audience member base. And of course, that's not empirically true, but I was just thinking that there's sort of like a Venn diagram, and there are three critical factors in the center. But to a certain extent, not to defeat my own theory, but authority is such an interesting word, because I think to a certain extent there's, of course, there's artistic authority, which comes from a music director, leaders in the orchestra, institutional leaders. And then there's sort of almost like a taste or community authority that comes from the audience base. There is a certain extent to Berlioz's dismay, but, we do try to balance a lot of programming to make sure that it's palatable based on the data we have from past seasons. So we want to make sure that, of course, whatever artistic authority is there is respected, honored, and prioritized. But then there is also this other side of, the audience does have authority to a certain extent too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead, Roxane, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. With authority, the word vision comes to mind too. You mentioned the music director, and then just the overarching vision for the organization as it moves forward, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and how we're thinking about diversity. And
yeah.
I thought next season we're incorporating poetry, which I was really excited about. And so I think vision is included in the idea of authority. And to me, not much can happen if there's not a collective vision that's agreed upon. Critical element.
Yeah, Roxane, you touched on an element of authority that I feel is being wielded in a really, really positive way at our orchestra and orchestras across the country, with this sense of we need to diversify the canon. We need to bring in artists and composers and works that have been historically underrepresented, and shed the light on them, give them their time in the sun. Those that repeat listening, I guess, that Berlioz I thought was so essential for any kind of work, making it in terms of success in the public eye. But it's so uplifting. I think we all the art sector has lots of work to do, big chunk of work cut out, but it's really wonderful to see across upcoming seasons this effort to elevate more living composers, more women composers of color, and artists too, the people performing, making those artists more representative of our communities and our culture. It's I'm really glad that authority, that word authority can come with kind of a negative, I guess, connotation. But I think, and I think maybe what we're seeing now in this movement is a meeting of, the public authority pushing these our institutions that are steeped in tradition to rethink what our role is in terms of creators of culture and purveyors of art, and being more, to encouraging us to be more adventurous, and yes, of course we have the canon is the canon for a reason, but there's I love seeing these seasons in the programming decisions opening up to more unfamiliar names and sounds. It's exciting times.
It is, and there's a lot of room for innovation, and that has already occurred this season. For example, my husband Larry Solowey, who's one of the co-principal horn players in the orchestra, the horn quartet was rehearsing here outside to do their performances at people's homes throughout the course of the last few weeks and continuing. And we had a neighbor who called and left a message on our machine saying, "We love hearing the brass quintet. It's so inspiring. It reminds me of when I used to be a musician. I want to go out and get back into keyboard playing." And we called her and talked to her and said, "Go out and buy a clavinova." She did. She went out and bought a clavinova, and now she's playing at home. And how great is that? That she's reconnected with her own music making. And it seems like that's part of our jobs in the community, is to connect people to their own music making, their own creativity. And how wonderful is that creativity has been reignited thanks to programs that the orchestra has had to fall back on because of COVID.
Right.
So it's been remarkable to see that impact. And wouldn't it be great, how often can we have that impact in the community if these little groups went out and just started playing pop-ups everywhere?
Absolutely. I think another thing that I've heard as long as I've been in artistic programming is that representation matters. And I've seen it firsthand. When I was living in New Orleans, our orchestra was lucky enough to get the cellist Sheku Kane Mason, who played at Meghan Markle's wedding, and he was, he kind of went viral. He was fantastic. And we had an open rehearsal for when he was playing Elgar with the orchestra. And there were 5 school buses of high school kids, and they just went nuts for him.
Yeah.
And they went right up to him and started asking him questions. And he saw somebody with a Bob Marley shirt, and he was like, "Oh, that's really cool." And he was a gem. And also he was 17, 18 years old, I think. And so he was kind of their age. And it was often with open rehearsals with high schoolers, they're kind of they do it and they listen, and most of the time they're pretty good, and then they go. But this was an immediate connection. And it was almost like we needed security because we had to keep the rehearsal going, and we couldn't just make it a big Q&A for him. But it was the most electric thing I've ever seen. And then all the performances sold out. It was teeming with people. We never needed security like we did that weekend with him there. And I think for that community, which has such a wonderful, present, thriving African-American community and always has, it was great. So yeah, I think it's really important to not only have representation and diversified composers and conductors, but soloists, and of course, have a plurality of voices as much as possible.
Yeah.
Well, we are reaching close to the bottom of our hour for the book club. So I wanted to take a moment as we start to wrap up our session today. The first order of business is to let you all know about the next one, of course. So Our next book club meeting is coming up. It'll be on Monday, May the 3rd at 10:30 a.m. And this is actually our final book club session of this season. We're going to be cracking the cover on Rough Ideas by Stephen Huff. Stephen Huff he's a celebrated concert pianist, and he is something of a polymath. The Economist named him as one of 20 living polymaths. So in addition to being an amazing performing artist, he's a writer and novelist. He's a composer. I believe he's in visual art. And in this collection of essays, he reflects deeply on his experiences as a performer, everywhere from the rehearsal space to the recording studio. He talks about the relationship between performer and audience, and he ruminates on many other topics outside of music as well, in a really relatable but unique way. So Samantha Bennett, our principal second violinist, brought this book to the table, and she feels it's a look into a really brilliant musical mind of today. So we have that to look forward to reading this month, gearing up for the next book club meeting. And I want to thank, of course, our sponsor of the Books of Note program, which includes this book club, the Gulf Coast Community Foundation, for making this series possible. It's been a really, really fun way to stay connected to all of you, and to stay engaged with musicians in a literary way. Kerry and Roxane, thank you for being on today.
Yes,
and
thank you, Roxane, for bringing us this book.
Yes, so rich in musical history and criticism, and this is one to keep on the shelf for a while, because it's one you got to digest, I think, in in chunks.
Neil.
Yeah. And to those of you who are watching, thank you so much for tuning in. It's been great to have you here, but it's been great to have you with us. And so we'll wish you a happy week ahead. May it be full of music and some great reading as well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.